Good afternoon. I want to talk to you about WWF's journey to protect biodiversity and how we've had to change our strategy several times over the last few years. What we've found is that to be effective, we need to respond to conditions as they are, not as we want them to be. And it means that we've had to change not only our strategy, but our staff and our partners and other things. So we were founded to protect biodiversity. Our goal is to work with endangered species to help species rebound. We were founded 55 years ago in 1961. And at that point, a number of species, from tigers to elephants to rhinos to dolphins and whales, were endangered. But what we soon found out was we couldn't work just with species. We needed to work on protected areas, on parks and systems to actually protect those species. And so we had to change our strategy and also change the people that we hired to work on it. And then we began to see that we needed to work on the larger issue of ecosystems and ecosystem services. And then we found out that most biodiversity doesn't actually exist in national parks. It exists in areas that people own and they use. And that if we're going to protect biodiversity, we have to work with the people who live with biodiversity and help them do that. But lately, what we've come to realize is that if we don't address the major threats to biodiversity, there won't be any by 2050. And in fact, what we've come to realize is that where and how we produce food is the biggest threat to the planet today. So we've had to change not our mission, but our strategy to maintain biodiversity on the planet. We've also found out that what was fit for purpose, what was good to be in an NGO in the 20th century is not what we need in the 21st century. The speed of change is much faster than our ability to address it. And this is true of all organizations, from governments to companies to other NGOs, etc. It's often 30 years between when we see an issue, when we first identify it, and when we actually see results on the ground, whether it's deforestation, overfishing, clean air, clean water, etc. It's taking us much too long to change. Now, we don't buy and sell any products. We don't make laws and regulations. And 15,000 projects, no matter how well conceived, are not going to protect biodiversity on the planet. We've got to figure out how to shift our strategy from doing conservation to influencing the outcomes that we want. And that means how we work with institutions that are big enough to make change happen at scale. Governments and the private sector. So what we've come to believe is that the role of NGOs in the 21st century is about influence. It's about generating the next issues and trends, creating awareness about them, building consensus about how you solve those problems, identify and documenting solutions and better practices and tools for addressing those issues, having a strategic focus, building consensus about that, and then handing it off to others to actually do the work. This is the issue of our time. This is the issue of the 21st century. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. Ideally, without using any more resources than we use today. And that's going to be hard. Here's why this is such a complicated issue. Today we have 7 billion people and they consume 1 unit of materials each per year, so we have 7 billion units of consumption. By 2050, we're going to have at least 9 billion people, probably closer to 10. They're going to have 2.9 times as much income per capita, per person, and they're going to consume twice as much as people today. So that means 18 billion units of consumption. If we're going to make that fit on the planet, we need to reduce how much water, how much land, how much fertilizer, how much pesticides, how much all the inputs are it takes to produce each unit of consumption by 60%. To have the same impact we have today, which is already beyond the carrying capacity of the planet in many places. So that's the challenge. And this is what's driving the challenge. I call it the China phenomenon. So it took the UK 155 years with 9 million people to double GDP. It took the US 53 years with 10 million people to double GDP. It took China 12 years with 1 billion people. It took India 17 years with 822 million people. China was 12 times the speed of Britain, was 100 times the scale. China lifted 400 million people out of poverty in 12 years. Every government should try to do that. That is the goal of what good governance is, but it has implications. People who have more money consume more, and this is what happens. So between 1995, which is when China had finished doubling GDP, and 2006, most of the people couldn't believe their good fortune. They saved their money. The Chinese savings rate was 30% of income during that period of 12 years after the doubling of GDP. And then they started to believe, hey, we're going to have this money. We can start consuming more. And so they started buying more food, upgrading their food to buy more animal proteins, more seafood, more exotic fruits and vegetables. And that started to have impacts on commodity prices. And so by 2008, we started seeing spikes in commodity prices. And after the 2008 recession, they came down, but then they went up even higher. Each of those yellow dots represents a food riot where somebody was killed in one of 23 countries. When food prices go up, when food becomes more expensive, people die. And so how we interpret that is that if it comes to a choice of feeding a child or cutting a tree, the tree is going to lose every time. So we have to figure out how to anticipate issues like this and prevent these choices from being made because we have better options. We also are beginning to understand that food security is probably the biggest national security issue of all. Right now, for the last century, food production has been the biggest impact on the planet. If we're going to double it, how do we still live on this planet? How do we keep the planet recognizable? We've lost 70% of biodiversity from producing food. 70% of the biodiversity loss associated with human activities is for producing food. 70% of the water that we use as people on this planet is used to produce food. Most single largest source of water pollution is producing food, the chemicals that go into food, and we use more chemicals to produce food than we do any other human activity. Food is one of the largest, if not the largest, sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Depending on your source, between 25 and 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from producing food. And in the last 150 years, we've lost about half of our topsoil on the planet from how we produce food. This is the history that we have to try to turn around in the next 35 years. Now let's just look at one issue, which is land. We currently use about 40% of the non-frozen or ice-covered terrain on the planet to produce food every year. There's about 5% that's desert, about 18% that's mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams, about 2% that's in cities and infrastructure, about 12% that's in national parks. And that leaves 23% more to produce food. But here's the catch. 23% versus 40%. We couldn't double food production if we wanted just by expanding. Agricultural sprawl is, in fact, the biggest threat to biodiversity. So we need to figure out how to intensify production, how to produce more with less, because in this final 23% of land is where most biodiversity is on the planet. We haven't just changed the plants and the surface of the planet, we've also changed the composition of the mammals. If you look, most biomass of mammals today on the planet is cattle. Second is humans. Third is sheep, and then pigs and goats and horses. Elephants are one tiny little dot down there in the bottom. That's all. So we've changed the composition as well as the habitat on our planet. And the real question is, how do we freeze the footprint of food? This much and no more. How can we produce more with less? So WWF has identified 35 places that are the most important from the point of view of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we started looking at those places and figuring out what are the threats to these 35 places. And we identified production of food as the most important. And these are the 15 commodities that are the most important. They're almost all food. A couple are timber and pulp and paper, and also biofuels. But even biofuels are food crops. So then we started looking at which companies actually, how do we develop a strategy around this? Are we going to focus on 7.4 billion consumers and try to influence the way they think in 6,000 languages in 200 plus countries around the world? Or are we going to work with 1.5 billion producers? We're not a development organization. We don't know how to do agricultural extension. That's not our job. So we began to look at who it is that buys and sells these commodities, and we found out that it's 300 to 500 companies for each commodity that control about 70% of the product. But as we dug into this, we realized just 100 companies actually control 25% of all 15 of the commodities we cared about. So that became our strategy. 100 companies, we can get our arms around that. And since we developed a strategy about 10 years ago, we've signed agreements with 70 of the largest 100 food companies globally, and we're well on our way to achieve the 25% certification of each of these materials. So going forward, the issue isn't what to think. There's not a blueprint. I can't tell you what to do as a company, as a government official, as an NGO, as a person. The issue is how to think. That's what we've really got to focus on. By 2050, doing everything the same as we're doing today, we're going to need to double food availability. We think there are 4 ways that we're going to be able to do that. Productivity and efficiency on the one hand, and waste and consumption on the other. On a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about the products they buy, or should all the choices be sustainable? And if you want all the choices to be sustainable, you work with the companies, not with the individual consumers. The average consumer takes about 3 seconds to make a choice. That's not much time to think about it. Waste. We waste 1 of 3 calories. Waste is one place where we can actually reduce how much food we have to produce. If we waste 1 in 3 calories, so 1 for every 2 that we consume, waste is 50% of the new food we need to produce by 2050. Waste is our best food production strategy, reducing food waste. We also can figure out how to rehabilitate land that's already being used to produce food. Can we double production by increasing soil organic matter, by making soil better? Can we halt the frontier, the expansion of the agricultural frontier? We currently use a liter of water to make 1 calorie of food. Can we reduce that? Can we use half a liter to produce 2 calories of food? That's the kind of math that we need to reach 2050. Genetics. We can argue about plant breeding and animal husbandry all day, but the reason we have cities is because we produce agricultural surpluses. We can feed people who don't produce their own food. It's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics, and that's always going to be different. That's always going to be political. But let's have those discussions as we go forward. We know that better practices are 100 times better than worse ones. But here's one of the things that we need to ask. Which is going to give us more food in the long run? Recognizing the best producers through certification or verification programs, or moving the rest of producers? We know that the bottom 25% of producers, in terms of their efficiency and performance, produce 50% of the impacts we care about, but only 10% of the product. So how do we shift the bottom? Voluntary standards move the top. They reward them. We've got to figure out how to work with government to move the bottom, to work with the worst performers. That's where the biggest gains happen, both for the planet and for total food production. And this is the one that we need to think about most. As we move from 10% of our production being from animal protein to 20% of our consumption being to animal protein, we have to double the amount of feed that we produce for animals. That has huge impacts on the environment. Only poultry has ever actually achieved the kinds of efficiencies that we're going to need to see in every industry going forward. They've done it by looking at feed use, mortality rates, age, etc. They didn't have to worry about animal welfare. They didn't have to worry about whether the seed was GMO. They didn't have to worry about whether antibiotics were used or not. We have to think about all those things now. So we have to measure what matters, and we have to find optimal solutions rather than try to maximize one variable. So sustainability, the challenge today, is to move from niche to norm. And we're seeing evidence of this already happening. Ireland as a country has made a commitment that 100% of their food exports will be certified sustainable by 2016. They're not going to make it, but they're about 80% of the way there, and no other country has ever made that commitment. The global salmon and aquaculture industry, 17 CEOs, which represent 70% of global production, have all agreed to share their information about how to improve their performance, because they realize the reputation of the entire industry is only as good as the worst performer. The issue going forward is about risk, both about the availability of raw materials as well as the reputation for the company. And here's why the reputation is so important. In 1975, 83% of the value of a company was the material things that that company bought and sold. By 2009, 81% of the value of a company was based on its reputation and its brand. So from things you could touch to reputation. That's why how you buy your products, how they're produced, matters. Just leave you with one final point. We've been hearing that there is a lot of illegality in how raw materials are produced. And so we've looked at these different commodities in different countries, and what we've found is that between 5 and 50% of all globally traded commodities are not produced legally in the country of origin. That's a risk. If you don't know how your raw materials are being produced as a company, you don't care. And if you don't care about your products coming in, you may not care about your products going out. So this is the kind of thing that companies are going to be asked to look at increasingly. None of us can work on all these issues, but all of us can work on some of these issues. Sustainability is a journey. It's not a destination. Think about it. Thank you very much.